let you know. Okay. Yeah, but I'm not actually going to, the recordings I do it for, but normally I don't paste that unless there's a need, because, but I have both the PowerPoint and the PDFs are attached. It's already on for this week. So if you open to week 1, you'll see that both the PowerPoint and the PDF of the PowerPoint are attached. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so today we will start looking at our intro to the whole area of soils. And in the book, it is in chapter 1, right? And so the question really, which one has to ask is, there's a lot of misconception about soils, right? Yeah. And so if I ask you, what do you think when you hear soil, what comes to your mind? Any ideas?
Ground.
What did you say? I heard something, but I was not clear, so you can say it again.
Somebody said ground. I said dirt.
Okay, so somebody said ground, somebody said dirt. Yeah. And any other ideas apart from this?
I guess nutrients for plants.
So nutrients for plants. Okay, so people think about it as nutrient for plants. Any other ideas? So we had that, we had ground, we had nutrients for plants. Any others? Whatever you think about soils when you hear of a soil. Okay, so as you have indicated, one of the major way people describe soil is dirt. And that is actually a misnomer, because the soil is a lot more complex than dirt. I will normally speak of dirt as a soil which is out of place, just as a weed is a plant which is out of place. And I'm hoping that as we go through this class, we will really understand the nature and the properties of soils, and also its applications to various aspects of science, and also in both environmental, agriculture, engineering, and other areas where soils are very critical. So what is soil when we talk about a soil? The term soil was derived from a Latin word, solum, right, which means floor or ground. So the person who said floor or ground has some basis, at least, rooted in the name of the soil for saying that, right? But basically, when we talk about soil, right, by a general definition we can give to soil is a loose surface of earth, a loose surface normally found on earth or moon, right, as distinguished from a solid rock, right? So any loose material surface which is found on any planet, including earth, right, which is not a solid rock, right, is normally referred to generally as a soil, right? And normally when we talk about loose surface, we can use the term unconsolidated, right? Unconsolidated as in place of loose surface, right? And consolidated in place of solid rock. So any unconsolidated material which is found on earth as distinguished from a consolidated material which is a solid rock is normally referred to as a soil. So those are general definitions of soil, right? And somebody also indicated the fact that soils provide nutrients to plants, right? Yeah, so some people also define soil as any material that supports plants and nourishes growing plants, right? Or supplies nutrients to plants. So again, that idea or that definition of soil is also part of the general definition of soils, which is given to soils, right? Yeah. But normally, for soil scientists, soil is defined in a more precise and also detailed way, right? And for the definition of soil, which we will actually use for this course, right? We will use the definition of soil as given by the Soil Science Society of America, right? And we will see, and that is soil is defined as the unconsolidated material, right? You remember we said that the unconsolidated material, right, is also referred to as the loose material, right? So unconsolidated mineral matter, which is found on the surface of the earth, right, which has been subjected to and influenced by genetic and environmental factors of parent material, climate, including moisture and temperature effects, macro and microorganisms, topography, all acting over a period of time and producing a product soil that differs from the material from which it is derived in many physical, chemical, and biological properties and characteristics. That's a long definition, right? But that, in a sense, captured the whole entity of soil and also gives us a little bit of background into the factors which are involved in the producing of the soils which we once see. If we look at the definitions, there are 5 factors which influence the soil which we see. The first is what we call the parent material, which is the original material which is derived from the rock on which the soil is formed from. All soils ultimately are derived from a parent rock or a consolidated material. And that material is what we refer to as the parent material, right? Then we have climate. Climate of the area normally will influence what type of soils you will have in a particular area, right? So soils which are found in a particular area will differ because of the differences in the climates, right? And when we talk about climate, the major influences of climate are moisture and temperature, right? So when we talk about the climate of an area, we are looking at the temperature and rainfall or precipitation patterns in that particular area. Then also the third major factor which influences the formation of a soil in a particular area are what we call the biotic factors, which is the macro and microorganisms. So big, macro, big, micro, small. So small and big biological organisms are also very involved in the formation of the soils. And when we talk about macroorganisms, right, yeah, we humans will be included in that. And we will talk about this later in the course. Then we have topography, which is the slope of the area. Soils which are normally found in a particular climatic area will sometimes differ based on the position in which they are formed on the slope or the topography of the area. And then the last factor which influences soil is time, right? And when we talk about time, we are not just talking about numerical time passing, but conditions which are either favorable or unfavorable to the formation of the soil in time, right? So we talk about young soils and we talk about old soils, right? Yeah, which is based on the favorability of the conditions which are available for the soil formation, right? So in the course of this class, we will go over all these factors and see how they are involved in the production of the soils, which is found in a particular area. So you will see from what is described over here that soils will differ from place to place, right? Soils like humans and plants have differences, right? Yeah. And that is why in the definition, it talks about genetic factors, right? Yeah. It is not DNA as such, but it is the original materials which or the original rock from which the soil is derived provides certain characteristics to the soil and the environmental factors which act on that. Right. So when we are studying soils, there are two basic views which we use in which are developed over the years. Right. The first is to consider the soil as a material entity, right, or a biologically or biochemically weathered and synthesized product of nature, right? So here we are looking at the soil which is formed based on the weather breaking down and the synthesis of the rock or parent material, right? Yeah. And this is called, normally will be the looking at the soil as a natural body, right? Yeah. The second view, which most people normally see soils as, that people, if you ask the average person in the street or average person what soils are like, they will either tell you that it's dirt, right? Or if they are very gracious, they will say that it is a material for plant growth, right? So most people, when they think about soils, normally will think of that as um, an agricultural material, that soils are only for people who are planting crops, right? So that second view is mainly have pertained for a long time because of the fact that plants grow in the soil. And since agriculture and food production are very important components of human existence, a lot of time has been, a lot of the study of soils, which was done in the last centuries, was mainly based on the soil's ability to provide nutrients for plants and also provide a place where plants are able to grow. So that second view was one of the dominant views, right? Yeah, which was held in the past, right? The first view, right, is normally referred to as pedology. Pedology, right? So that's a key word to one of the key words to remember, pedology, right? And pedology, by definition, is the study of the origin of soil, right? And its classification and description, right? Yeah. So when we look at pedology, one key thing to remember is that pedology studies the soil as a material body, right? It studies the soil it regards the soil as a material entity or a body of materials and studies it for what it is rather than what it can do, right? Yeah, that is a very important thing, right? So in pedology, it focuses primarily on its immediate, it does not focus primarily on its immediate practical use or utilization. It studies the soil for what it is, right? And that is very important, right? Whilst edaphology, which is the second view, which looks at soil from the point of view as a medium of plant growth, right, is looking at it from its immediate practical utilization, right? So in edaphology, we are looking at the soil, one aspect of the soil as a means for plant growth. So we are looking at a function, right? The soil from its function, one of its functions, because edaphology really is just one functional view of soil, and that is looking at soil as a medium of plant growth. Okay, any questions for me thus far? You can put your questions in the chat box if you, yeah. But is there any questions at this? Okay. So we will. So what are the functions of a soil in our ecosystem, right? Yeah. If the soil has intrinsic values of itself. What are the functions of the soil? The first one, as indicated, is the soil being a medium of plant growth and also being able to provide nutrients to plants, right? Yeah. And for a long time, for the average person, that is the only view of soil which people have, which is the daphological view, right? But the soil is also recycles nutrients and organic waste, right? And the soil also serves as a system for water supply and purification, right? And then the soil has a lot of microorganisms, right? In fact, most of the microorganisms that we find in our biosphere is found in soils, right? So the soil is very rich in its metabolic activities, right? And the soil is also an engineering medium, right? We build roads on it, we build houses on it, we build structures on it. And the soil's ability to withstand the forces which are placed on it is very important to the civil engineer, right? So when we look at the functions of the soil, right? When we look at the soil as a medium for plant growth, right, which is called a daphology. Here, the daphologist, or the one who studies the soil primarily as a medium for plant growth, right, is concerned about the soil's ability to produce food and fiber, right? So that's the ultimate goal of the daphologist, right? So if you are interested in the soil's ability to provide food and fiber as the ultimate goal, what do you think are some of the things one will look for? Any ideas? What will you look for if your main goal in studying soil is looking at it for its ability to provide food and fiber?
Looking at like the moisture that it'll hold.
Okay, so you will look at its ability to hold moisture because moisture is very important, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else?
You look for the elements in
Okay,
the
so you
soil.
look for the elements, especially those which provide nutrients to the plant, right? Yeah. So that you want to look at the soil's ability to provide those nutrients. Does it have the right nutrients, or is it lacking in some of those nutrients? What else? What else can you think of? So we are talking about the moisture level, we are talking about nutrients, right? Yeah.
The components of it, so like the way it
Okay,
has
the
dirt.
components of the soil. Okay. When you say components, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking like how they have like different types of dirt or like different types of soil it is, like whatever area you're trying to grow your
I'm
plant.
happy that you corrected yourself with soil. Okay. Yeah, so the components of the soil. What do you think the components of the soil are why would they be very important to study?
Because that can help determine the type of plant growth that you'll get versus what you expect, because different plants grow in different types of areas as well as different types of soils.
Okay, so that is one. So those physical properties of the soil will be very important for us to study, because the physical properties of the soil will influence its ability to hold moisture, right? And also it will also help us to understand what type of nutrients and other things in it are in it, right? Yeah, because the plant which is growing up in the soil will need certain conditions for it to thrive, right? So what you have brought up are very important properties, right, which the edaphologists will want to know, right? So the edaphologist or the soil scientist who is interested in looking at the soil for reason of plant growth will look at all the various properties, right, or the variations which affect the productivity of the soil, right? Yeah, and find means of either conserving the good ones and improving the productivity, right? Yeah, so we have soil scientists whose major task is to look at these properties, right? Yeah, so the pathologists have a place. Then we have the soil as a recycler of waste, right? Yeah. And the soil, in the soil, waste are broken down and recycled, right? And this is mainly mediated by soil microorganisms, right? Yeah. And why is this very important property of the soil? Any ideas on that? Why is this a very important property of the soil? Or is it a very minor property of the soil?
I guess instead of getting rid of it, I guess you could use it for something else.
Okay, so instead of getting rid of it, we can. If the soil is not it didn't have the capacity to break down waste and recycle it, what are some of the consequences?
There'll be more waste
can
left
get-
over in the ecosystem.
Okay, so we will have a lot of waste, right? Sitting around. Well, one thing I will say, which may be gross to you, is that what will happen to all the dead bodies? All the people who have lived and died will still be with us, right? Because they will not break down, they will not decompose, right? And that will affect also the carbon cycle, right? What is the carbon cycle? Anyone has any idea of the carbon cycle? Have you heard of the carbon cycle?
I have.
Okay, so what is it?
Um,
In your view, in your simple, yeah.
Okay. The carbon cycle is basically the process in which like the carbon is continuously traveling throughout the atmosphere and then it's being put back into the earth the same way it goes out. So it has to do with the sunlight and the photosynthesis of plants and how it goes into the air and comes back through like dead waste and organisms.
Okay, so we have photosynthesis as a major part, right? Where the CO2 in the air is transformed to organic carbon, right? In the form of carbohydrates, especially of various forms. Carbohydrates or organic bonds of different forms. You have carbohydrates, you have cellulose, we have lignin, right? Yeah, in plants and all those things. So, and then we also take that plants and all those things for food and other things. So that organic carbon is from the air is captured, right? Yeah, into organic forms by photosynthesis. What is the reverse of that? Which sends the carbon, organic carbon back to the air as carbon dioxide. You describe it. What do we call that? We have different names for it, but what is it essentially?
Respiration.
When things break down, what do we call them? What do we call that process? Okay, when we eat bread, potatoes, and other stuff, what is the process by which we break it down?
Glucose.
Okay, glucose. What is that? What is glucose part? What is the production of glucose? What process is it part of?
Decomposition.
Okay, decomposition. But what is a very technical term for the decomposition? Which we are doing right now as we breathe in and out.
Respiration.
Respiration. So decomposition actually is respiration, right? Where organic materials combine with oxygen in a very controlled way and are then returned back as inorganic carbon, as carbon dioxide or methane or carbon monoxide, right? Yeah. So decomposition actually is the reverse of photosynthesis, right? Yeah. So in soils, the breakdown of waste, right? Organic waste and it's returned to the returned as CO2, right? It's respiration, right? Yeah. But we called it decomposition because that process results in the breakdown of waste, right? Or so from our point of view, it is decomposition, right? But it's basically the same way in which we break organic carbon in our cells, and then we produce carbon dioxide as a result. right? Yeah, so the recycling of waste in soils is a major part of the carbon cycle, which the major actors involved are microorganisms, right? And we will talk about different microorganisms which are involved in the process, right? The soil also acts as a purifier of water, right? Yeah. So when water, rain falls, snow falls, it moves through the soil, right? It passes through the soil, right? Yeah. The soil is able to hold on to certain nutrients which are charged in it, and we will find out why is that important, right? And the soil is also able to store water in its pores. So apart from purifying water, it also is able to store water in its pores and release the water to plants, right? We said that somebody said the properties of the soil are important. One of the major properties of the soil is its ability to hold water and its ability to take nutrients, certain nutrients from the water and other fluids which passes through it, right? Yeah. And so that water which passes through the soil goes to the groundwater, which we can use as a source of drinking water, right? So that's a very important function of the soil also. And then we have the soil also being, we said that microorganisms are involved in the soil's ability to recycle waste, right? And that ability is a very important component of the soil's properties, right? Biochemical properties. The soil has bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi, right? Yeah. And we talked about the degradation aspect for microorganisms, but microorganisms also are also notorious, right? Because they can also cause diseases, right? Which is something not desirable. So we want to know which microbes are there, and are they beneficial, or are they bacteria or fungi which cause disease. One thing I will let you know upfront is that 99% of the microorganisms which are in the soil are beneficial, right? Yeah. Only very small amounts, a group of them cause disease. But normally, because we don't like disease and the losses through crops and other things, we sometimes focus a lot of time on the disease causing bacteria or microorganisms, which we call pathogenic ones, and forget that really we need these microbes in the soil, because without them in the soil, the carbon cycle will stop one of these days, because you will get all the CO2 in the air captured into organic bonds, and then life will stop, right? So carbon dioxide in the air is very important, right? And the recycling of that organic carbon back to the inorganic carbon is also a very important function of the soil, right? Apart from carbon, the soil also recycles other elements like nitrogen. Nitrogen is recycled also, and the nitrogen cycle is also mediated by microorganisms, the phosphorus cycle, the sulfur cycle. So the cycling of nutrients in the soil is a very important product of the microorganisms which inhabit the soil, right? And the last major function of the soil, right, which we will talk about, is the soil as an engineering medium, right? And this is where, for the civil engineer, he or she looks at the soil as an engineering medium, right? Yeah. And in this respect, any unconsolidated or loose materials, right, will have solids, gases, and spaces. And these type of solids, whether they are clay materials, sandy materials, or silt type materials, will affect its ability to hold structures or components on its surface. So the civil engineer, is interested in the ability of the soils to resist compression and also to remain in place. So these are all various functions of the soil, right? Yeah. So when we look at the functions of the soil, right, as a medium of plant growth, right, as a recycler of waste, as purifier of water, right, as a habitat for microorganisms, and then as a medium for plant growth. These are all looking at soil from a functional view, right, from a functional view, right? So, so for the soil as a medium of plant growth, we give it a specific name, edaphology. But the edaphological view is a functional view of the soil, as opposed to looking at the soil, as from a pedagogical point of view, right? Yeah, where you look at the soil as a natural body. Any questions? Yeah, so for example, when the civil engineer looks at the soil, for example, he will look for rock slides, right, on highways, right, can be engineering problem in mountainous areas, right, yeah. So he will look at how are the soils in these areas prone, right, to breaking down and falling, right. Also muck soils or soils where you have a lot of water sitting on it, right? And therefore is subject to settling, right? Will not be very important source for foundations for roads and other building materials. So those are other things the civil engineer will look at, right? One thing also to note is that there are soils which are manufactured, right? They are not true soils, right? Yeah, but they are put together in order to make them desirable for certain purposes. For example, soils which are used in greenhouses are manufactured, right? In the sense that the topsoil is taken and sand and organic matter are added to it to provide proportions of the four components, right? Solid spaces, pore spaces, and also air spaces for the soil to be able to use. Also, they are made such that they are lighter and therefore easy to carry around. Also, soils which are normally found in golf courses are also manufactured. They are not ordinary soils, right? Yeah. So they are constructed by excavating the land and filling it with a base of sand and gravel, which will allow drainage of water through the soil. And those soils also are giving quite a bit of nutrients, right? Yeah. So those soils are also regarded as manufactured soils. And soils which are used for bedding plants and hanging plants, right, are also largely made up of organic matter, right, and so that they will be light to handle and transport, right? So these are all, right? So when we look at the uses of soils in general, right, we can look at plant production, animal production, construction of houses, construction of road, waste disposal. So there are a whole lot of uses for soils, which we will be looking at, right? Yeah. So in our next lecture, we will start looking at the study of soil as a natural body, right? If we are going to understand the soil and also its properties and apply it, right, to the various functions, then it is better to study the soil as a natural body, right? So in this class, we will use the soil science definition of the soil, and we will use the pedagogical approach to study soils, right? Which is the study of the origin of soil, its classification, and its description, right? And the fact that pedology studies the soil as a natural body and does not focus on the on its practical utilization. So we need to understand the soil. And once we have understand the soil and its processes, we can then be able to apply it to the various studies. So the environmental scientist wants to understand the processes in the soil. The civil engineer wants to understand the processes in the soil. The soil microbiologist, the soil physicist, the soil chemist all will be interested in looking at the properties of the soil, right? The hydrologist will want to look at the properties of the soil, right? Yeah. The waste management expert will want to look at it. And then the agriculturist, the animal scientist will want to study the soil's ability to supply nutrients to certain forages and other aspects, which will. So when we look at it from that point of view, the soil is a very critical element in the biological and ecosystem, which is very fundamental to the existence of life. And as we look at it and study it, it allows us to manipulate it to satisfy the different objectives and functions which the soil can provide. Okay, so I will end here and then we will pick up on looking at the soil as a natural body and then look at the ways in which we study the soil. So that will be what we'll be considering in our next session on Wednesday. Okay, as I said, the PowerPoint is attached and also the PDF is attached. You can take a look over it so that we want our discussion to be a little bit more iterative, yeah, so that we can talk about it as we study it. Okay, as I indicated, we won't have lab this week, right? Yeah, and we will give you more information on the lab before we start it. Also, I've seen a few of you who are asked to be switched in the labs. I have done some of them. I just saw one this morning, and I will see whether I will be able to